I'm going to measure out 2 millimeters on either side. Now I got to add the shoulder line with the marking gauge. And I'm cutting just on the outside of the line. I'm not going to be paring back with a chisel. So that dovetail fits pretty nicely. Welcome to Woodworking Skills for Beginners video with me, Sean Evelegh, where we're going to be cutting a half-blind dovetail. The tools you'll need are a dovetail saw, a crosscut saw, a fret saw, a bevel edge chisel set, a mallet, a marking gauge, a square, a dovetail marker, a marking knife, a rule, and a pencil. Dovetails are probably the most famous joint in the world, commonly used for cabinets and boxes, but half-blind dovetails are mainly used in drawers, and that is because the tails don't protrude past the pin board. It leaves the front of the drawer very clean, and as you open up the drawer you will see the joint on the side. So the first step when cutting dovetails, whether it be a through dovetail or a half blind, is to mark out and cut your tail board. So I'm going to head over to the vise, put this in here, and with a board this size, I think 3 tails looks good. I always come in around 5 to 6 millimeters from each side. You want the outer pins to be wider than the central pins because it hasn't got any supporting material on the outside of the joint. These had to be pretty strong here. And the distance between these two marks is 9 centimeters. So I'm just going to divide that by 3. So I'm going to mark 3 and 6 here. And from these 2 points I just made, I'm going to measure out 2 millimeters on either side. So the top of the pin will be 4 millimeters. And then I'm going to get my square and mark out these lines. Next I'm going to get my dovetail marker. I'm using a 1:8 ratio, that's my favourite. And I'm going to draw that line down. Flip it for the other side. If you want to, you can also mark this on the back, so you can make sure you're cutting straight, but I'm just going to mark it on the front. Now I've got to add the shoulder line with the marking gauge. Now a half blind doesn't protrude through the pin board. Normally I would set my marking gauge to slightly over the thickness of the material, because then I'll be flushing off the tails after. But because these tails don't go all the way through, I'm going to set my marking gauge around 3 millimeters from that edge. Lock that in. Now, with this tail board, I'm going to mark the outside shoulders. I'm going to mark the full length of the back. The next shoulder. Now some people would mark the full length of this. I don't like doing that because then I have to plane this full board to remove that marking gauge line, and they can often be quite deep. So I just like marking the waste material, so then I don't need to do as much cleanup later. So I'm just going to put the wheel of the marking gauge in between the tails and gently roll it back and forth, making sure not to go over that pencil line. Like that. Okay, so now I've got that all marked out. I'm going to put this back in the vise and use my dovetail saw. This is a fine tooth dovetail saw, 20 TPI. When I'm cutting thin stock, I like using this. If I was cutting dovetails in 1 inch thick stock, I would go for a lower TPI, maybe 14, because it's a lot thicker. But I'd want a fine tooth for this. And I'm cutting just on the outside of the line. I'm not going to be paring back with a chisel. I'm going to use my fret saw here just to remove this waste. If you don't have a crosscut saw, you can use your dovetail saw for this, but I've got a crosscut saw here. Now this line, I am going to go slightly off it because I'll be paring that back with a chisel. Now I'm going to clamp the piece to the workbench and use a chisel to clean up these shoulders. Now I'm adding a slight undercut. Making sure there's no high spots. Alright, so now the tails are cut. To help me mark out the pins more easily, I'm going to add a tiny lip to the back of these tails. And that's going to help them locate on the edge of the board. So I've just got a chisel here. I'm going to use a smaller one. And I'm just going to remove this material, meeting that marking gauge line on the bottom of the tails. Just make a little notch. So now the tails are cut, I'm going to mark the pin board. So I'm going to put the pin board in the vise. I've got a plane here that's going to help me hold the tail board up. So I'm just going to get it a hair higher than the plane. So I've set that board just above the surface of the plane, and you can see with that little notch we made, it's now just engaging. And that's going to help us, when marking out the tails, know how deep to draw the line. So I've got my marking knife here. I'm going to use my largest chisel just to butt up these two ends so they're both flush. Bring the tail board in. Let it seat on that shoulder. And then very carefully I'm gonna mark out these pins. Start off with a gentle mark. If you push too hard in the beginning, then it's going to follow the grain and go away from the tail. And you want to push hard down on the tail board so it doesn't move. Okay, now I'm going to get my marking gauge again, which is still set to the length of the tails, and I'm only going to mark the waist. Just going to make these lines a bit deeper so they're clearer. And now I'm going to need a shoulder line. And I want this joint to be flush. So I'm going to reset the marking gauge. And a quick way you can do this is just drop the marking gauge down onto the table, referencing off the thickness of the board, and then you're going to get the exact same thickness. And I'm just going to draw this line across the whole length. This will be hidden in the final joint because it's inside the joint. And now with a square and a pencil, I'm going to carry on those knife lines down, and that's going to help me guide my saw and cut straight. Okay, so now we have to remove all this material in the middle. If you're comfortable with your dovetail saw, you can again cut just on that line, on the waist side of the line. However, this angle is quite tricky because you need to cut at an angle. It's quite likely to not be accurate. So I'm going to cut off the line and chisel back to it. So I'm going to clamp this in the vise. Normally with a through dovetail, you're cutting all the way through the board, but because we're keeping this face clean, I can only cut diagonally and remove as much material as I can with the saw. Then I'm going to need to do a lot of chiseling. So you can see I've just loosened off the material on either side of the pin. Now I'm going to use a chisel and attack both sides and remove all that waste. Okay, so the pins are cut. Let's give it a test fit. So what I'll do now is I'll take the joint apart, we'll add some glue, and that is the joint complete. So I'm going to add glue on all the surfaces. If there's any gaps, this glue should help swell the wood and fill that in. So that dovetail fits pretty nicely. What I'm going to do is leave this to set and then we'll come back and see how it looks. So that is the half-blind dovetail. It's a bit harder to cut than a standard dovetail, but with a bit of practice anyone can do it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Remember to like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.